Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the fourth webinar by XSCALE Alliance. Today we will be covering product management and the pattern language of XSCALE to figure out what's worth building. The webinar will be hosted by Peter Merel, Chief Ecosystem Officer, and myself, Stefan Wolpers. Pete.
Hey, Stefan. So we should probably give you some sort of formal intro too, since you are an XSCALE Alliance steward. I don't know exactly what we should say about you.
Well, I'm just a guy who's trying to run the controls here of the software, hoping it will not crash during the webinar.
You are very far from just a guy. Well, look, let's get into it, and we'll see where we get. Okay, so we're going to talk today about product management, and some aspects of product management I think don't get very much or really anywhere near sufficient attention in product circles and in Agile circles. So I think we have to begin with a motivation. We have a lot of people called product owner, and if we're asserting there's something that they're not doing, we'd better be clear about what it is and why it's important. So I think most people will be familiar with the idea of a burn-up chart, that we have a lot of stories, and we measure how fast we're delivering things, and we try to give commitments on that basis. And some people will have seen cumulative flow diagrams, where we try to understand for a particular story what kind of state it is in. Is it in progress, or is it already continuously integrated with the other stories? Now, if we go a little bit further, we expect that stories add up to some sort of coherent business feature that gives us some value. So you would expect we're going to have to do some testing of a feature before we let it into everybody's homes. And then we've got system integration testing. And this sort of assemblage of curves gets called a cumulative flow diagram. This is kind of the limit of people's view of the way that Agile value streams work. At least it's the limit of the delivery view of things. But it doesn't say very much about business throughput. It doesn't say very much about the product view of the world. And that's a problem, because we have this. Go on.
I find this really interesting. So on the one side, given that Scrum is so popular, I believe the product owner is the most abused role in the whole framework.
I think it's a scapegoat role.
A lot of organizations seem to go agile by printing new business cards for the business analysts, now calling them product owners. And on the other side, so in my mental model, the left part of the value creation arc, so the whole product discovery part, what actually makes sense to build, starting from the vision and then ending up on the product backlog, is most of the time completely out of sight.
Yeah, since it's invisible, there's no way we can optimize it. And there's no way that people can look at this and say, oh, look, there's a bottleneck, there's a problem there. So we have to look at the other side of this yellow curve. So if it's okay with you, I'll look at that a little bit.
Yes, please.
Okay. So we expect that certainly delivery is sucking up a lot of our operating expense. But just going from vision, business drivers, business constraints, to some sort of release plan for features, accounting for the budgets we need to deliver each feature and the priorities of the features, well, that has to be something we do in a coherent way. If we start at the other end, if we start with lots of stories and we do story mapping or empathy mapping or lots of those kinds of mapping, and we try to work up towards the features, we're kind of starting at the wrong end of the telescope. We don't know that we're actually going to deliver any business value. We just had a whole bunch of stories that stakeholders or customers told us, and we're trying to make sense of them. It makes much more sense in terms of a flow to try and work breadth first. And that's really fundamental to a coherent product management approach, where we know that we're not getting most of the value dropping through the cracks. We could do extremely disciplined delivery and get really great quality into the stories and do all of the quality automation and DevOps stuff and still completely fail to impact our market or to deliver whatever the business value is supposed to be if we don't do a good job of this. So we really need...
Yes.
Mm.
I mean, we all know that Scrum is perfectly suited to build stuff nobody wants in a very effective way, right?
Oh, yes. So much money wasted so efficiently. So once we've got a clear picture of the features, well, we still have to control them. So that means we have to nail down the acceptance criteria for the features. And that's where this BDD, Three Amigos stuff that John Smart, who we had here last week, John Ferguson Smart, I should say, because there's a John Smart at Barclays who's not the same John Smart. Well, John's done a beautiful job of work at how we do this kind of work together, testers and developers and analysts, the Three Amigos pattern, and how we can control that using standard Agile tools. That's all beautiful, but the question that I like to ask with this diagram is well, which one of these curves really counts as business throughput? And since we're having a podcast, I'm going to put you out of your misery. I don't think any of those are business throughput. I think they're all components of operating expense, which is kind of what you would expect. So I think that business throughput has to have something to do with getting a return on doing all these activities. And without accounting for that return, we can't do coherent product management. But the trouble is, there must be some curves for this return. It can't just be a straight line. The cost accounting assumes that there is some fixed cost per unit of revenue, but we know that's not true. There's a man named Goldratt. Unfortunately, he passed away a decade or two ago. He came up with this theory of constraints, which is a very, very simple theory. It just says that in any field, any process of production, there are many constraints, and there's always one constraint that is the bottleneck, that is the dominant constraint. And if we work on anything else, we're not going to be able to increase throughput. We have to work on whatever constraint is currently the bottleneck constraint. So in product management, we need to be able to look at our business throughput this way, or to be able to look at our market this way. And this is an approach that derives from a theory that a man named Dave McClure in San Francisco came up with about 10 years ago. He actually came up with this because he runs an incubator called 500 Startups, and he wanted to improve the quality of business plans that were coming across his desk. And so he said, well, look, if your business plan doesn't account for acquiring customers, activating, which is to say, getting them to identify themselves well enough that someone, not necessarily them, would be willing to pay you for their activities. So for example, Google putting a cookie in someone's browser and then tracking what they look at, that gets Google paid by advertisers. That's a form of activation. Retention, they have to keep on coming back to your offering or to your ecosystem. If they don't, then you've got got no ability to be paid for that activity, because there isn't any, unless you happen to be some sort of 24-hour gym. Referral, you want the people who are involved to bring other people into your ecosystem. This is the viral cycle. And then you do have to be able to get paid. The return end of this is important. So McClure didn't look at this in terms of theory of constraints, and not certainly knew about theory of constraints. He looked at it as a way to qualify business plans as to whether he'd be willing to invest in them or not. And this pirate metrics, I should say, the reason they're called pirate metrics is the acronym, acquisition, activation, retention, referral, return. The acronym is R, like pirate noises. So, so anyway, without looking at this as something that happens over time, we can't get a clear picture of the constraints involved in throughput. So let's imagine, I should say, this is an extremely simple linear programming model. It's basically looking at if we get $10 for every billing subscription that we manage to sell from our web app, then we've got a certain rate at which people are going to move from one of these states of being to another, well, then 10% of 10% of that $10 is going to be our return, which is to say every person we acquire is effectively worth a dollar. Well, let's imagine that we don't do anywhere near as well on acquisition as we would like. So acquisition effectively suppresses activation. We can't activate people we haven't acquired, and that suppresses retention. You can't retain people you haven't activated. You can't get referrals from people you don't retain, and you won't get return unless you've got those people in the ecosystem. So basically that squishes everything. So here, the bottleneck is acquisition. We should be focusing on that. That should be, in product management terms, all of our priorities should be going to features that will increase that acquisition. And having the analytics, knowing what they are, means that we can make an intelligent choice about which of these things is a bottleneck at one time or another. If activation is the bottleneck, then we're not going to get any improvement in throughput by prioritizing acquisition features. And we need to know, well, when has it moved from one constraint to another? These are very gross constraints and probably much finer grained qualitative constraints, root causes of these things. We need to know about those too. But let's start with something we can measure easily. We can get this stuff out of Facebook or Google Analytics. So if, let's say that retention is the bottleneck, well, any work we do on referral or return is not going to improve that constraint. And for that matter, any work we do on acquisition or activation isn't going to. Now, this is a very simple model. Of course, these curves don't really look like this. But when we start to understand that the bottleneck moves around, the market bottleneck moves around, then it tells us that we better do continuous product management. We better understand how to understand this for multiple value streams in a portfolio. And we better apply scientific rigor to it. If we don't, then it doesn't matter how red in the face a product owner goes, how hard they bang on the desk. Or for that matter, let's say that actually they're calm as a lamb. It's their stakeholders that bang on the desk, which is probably more common. It's not going to do anyone any good. We have to use numbers, science. This is the 21st century. So this is a motivation for changing the product management game. We have to get away from the intuitional product management idea that somehow the gut of that guy standing over there with a tie on is going to tell us the answers to these questions. We have to move away from that and move into a place where we can understand all of the constraints that are involved and then make trade-offs, intelligent trade-offs, rational trade-offs based on numbers. Does that make sense so far, Stefan?
Oh, to me, absolutely. I mean, there are so many nice stories around the whole issue we're talking about. For example, just a recent nice blog post on survivorship bias, right? How to prioritize what you're building. I mean, being data-driven can also lead you in the wrong direction if you're just focusing on the wrong group or wrong part of the channel, yes. Right? I mean, yes. If you build everything for the 0.6% of your prospective audience or possible audience that is already on your site and paying you, maybe you get it wrong because the 99.4% may be more interesting.
Completely agree. That's where we start to try to look at market segments and, for that matter, patterns of behavior, patterns of interaction with the systems. That's where we have to do root cause analysis. It's fine to know that, oh, well, we're not retaining people. Great. Why are we not retaining them? And we need the numbers on that. So a lot of the science here doesn't have adequate tool support at all.
The interesting thing I'm running into over and over again is that there's so much ego involved, right?
Yes.
People throw a lot of resources at solving one part of the equation. For example, moving the needle from to reduce the churn rate by 0.6%. And then you ask them, okay, what would you have been able to achieve bottom line at the end if you had allocated those resources to somewhere earlier in the process, right? And they simply don't understand what you're talking about, right? Because they did their job, they reduced the churn rate.
Yeah,
right?
So I kind of think that almost all of the evil in the world comes from people solving only part of a problem and then assuming that somehow that's magically going to lead to a solution to the rest. If we don't continuously focus on the bottleneck, then we're going to wind up in a place where we'll go out of business, or we'll have an effect on the environment that'll drive a bunch of other people out of business that could have been giving us benefit. So there's a need here to understand all of the constraints and then reconcile them. And so this brings us to a concept that comes out of Lean UX. In Lean UX, they talk about a product team, where we have business people and design people and technical people working together to be able to design a solution to business, design, and technical constraints. If we don't account for all of these things, then we can't have any kind of rational approach to acceptance criteria. We can't control the delivery of the work in a rational way, and we can't get feedback from those analytics that actually will inform rational decisions. We'll get one or another person playing games with management, politics dominating the decision-making, and we wind up in a bad place. So in Lean UX, their idea is we get business stakeholders, design stakeholders, and technical stakeholders to work together to define, in their case, the experience. But in our case, we want to define and design the product ecosystem. I say ecosystem because any product we build is basically intermediating between a bunch of different market segments. If we think about Uber, it's easy to think about drivers and passengers, but any broadly appealing product is intermediating for a very broad range of different segments. So when you think about Facebook as an ecosystem, Google, Apple, all of these things, they took an ecosystems design approach to their products rather than taking an experience-based approach to their products. So we're not saying that Lean UX solves the whole problem. We're saying this pattern of getting these guys together in a room, working face-to-face on a regular cadence in a small team, that's a really great idea. That gives us an ability to attack these constraints. Does that make sense so far, Stefan?
I agree wholeheartedly.
So this is where I was influenced by these ideas. Was I was involved as coach for a program called Kaching in Commonwealth Bank of Australia, 2011 through to 2013. About 15 months in all, actually, on and off. Well, actually, it was mostly on. And this program was very troubled to begin with. And it wasn't the fault of anyone in particular. It was the fact that we didn't have all these people in a room on a regular basis. They weren't seeing eye to eye. The technical team was being accused of terrible under-delivery. The business guys were pounding on the desk, and the design guys, who were a consultancy called Vivant, they were doing their best to satisfy stakeholders with very different requirements of them. The technical stakeholders were ropeable because they were being given pixel-perfect prototypes that couldn't be matched with the technologies that they were working with. And the business guys kept driving them with lots and lots of iteration, and then being frustrated that what actually turned up didn't match the vision, the business intent, and the timing. So this was at the time, a very messy, a very troubled program. And it was partly my fault because I had trained the delivery folk, and Rob Webb, who was GM who owned that, bless him, gave me a shot at trying to resolve these problems. And we came up with a practice pattern language that turned this program into an all-star for that bank. It in 18 months with just 30 odd people, it went from an underperforming experiment that was branded something other than CBA, I think, so that the bank would have deniability if it failed, and they could just say, oh, it was a startup, we didn't really care about it, to the primary digital channel for the entire bank. 18 months later, the Australian Financial Review valued it at $9 billion. It was it won several dozen external product awards. It won the Group CIO award for best program in the bank. And almost everything that we did where we could attribute the win was all about agile product management, breadth first product management, and the patterns we were using for that. We had to do some nice things. We had really good delivery people. We had to do some things to correct some of the problems in delivery, but that was easy. That was just simple agile coaching. Bringing those three types of stakeholder together, having a little product squad that worked to a tight weekly cadence, actually had daily stand-ups, that's really what made the difference. And the way that we ran those. Go ahead, Stefan.
I was just thinking, isn't it crazy that the good old learning of garbage in, garbage out also applies to these kind of projects?
Yes.
That the make or break of the latest success is actually further to the left side or at the beginning of the time axis, not at the end. That
yes.
If you come up with a good idea that actually is appreciated by future customers, the implementation is actually the least of your concerns. I mean, okay, you have some issues on the tech stack side usually.
Yeah.
But once you solve the critical issues, this is just business as usual, right?
Yeah. Well, people often talk about bringing quality to the left. And we talked about that a bit in our DevOps session last week. But really what we're trying to do here is bring product to the left. This is not something where we use lean startup to pivot on a regular basis. No, we need to look breadth first across the epic landscape, and we need to be able to color it in according to where the potential exists. If we can't do that, Agile is a hill climbing algorithm. I'm an old geek. We used to talk about that when it came to search spaces. It's happy to climb up a hill of value when there's a Mount Everest right next door. It will never see Mount Everest. It'll just climb up the foothill and it'll dance around the top of the foothill saying, "Yay, we've dominated our niche." But it won't explore the potential for leapfrogging, and that's where a lot of the work we have to do involves questioning business case. And we'll look at Pirate Canvas and impact mapping for that purpose in just a moment. I'll move on if it's okay, Stefan.
Yes, please. We have about 10 or so minutes left before we would start.
Okay, then I will try and go as fast as I can without skipping too much. So how do we get that product squad to do its work? We have a picture here that might surprise some people. The idea that we have sort of a shark jaw relationship between the precision with which we have identified or described our work items and the relationship between that and the flow of definition, that we're breaking things into smaller pieces, that won't come as much of a surprise. But what we really want to do is start with that vision that, and often the vision is quite negative. The vision is often, people think, oh, it's got some beautiful vision of the world of tomorrow. No, our vision is something sucks. There's something that is really bad in the way the world works. We'd like to fix it. And we have beginnings of an idea about how to go about it. Maybe we even have a little proof of concept about how we can go about fixing it. But without that idea that there's something that is driving us, there's something unfortunate, we can't derive a landscape of epics. And when I say epic, I mean something where we have identified the business driver for one of those metrics, or possibly multiples, depending on how we go about structuring things. We've identified who the market segments are, and what we've identified the assumptions we made between the two. This is where we get into impact mapping. We've identified how we expect to change the behavior of that market segment for that epic, or those market segments for that matter. It may be that we have a lovely idea, but if we don't change someone's behavior, then we can't have any impact. So we have to have an understanding of how we expect to change their behavior, and then what we need to deliver to achieve that. So that's sort of the epic level of this. Once we've got a landscape of epics, we have to get an idea of what sorts of release goals we have. We can't just say, oh, well, we're going to boil the ocean and deliver the perfect product all at once, and it's going to capture all, the entire market and everything will be great. No, we have priorities to deal with, and to deal with priorities, we have to have some specific goals. And a specific goal might be something like, we would like to open our retention bottleneck. But it could be something like, we would like an MVP, thank you very much. Okay, what's in an MVP? Often, business stakeholders will try to pack as much as possible into the initial MVP release, and it'll drag on for months or even years, and it really becomes a maximum volume product rather than a minimum viable product.
Yes, so another of these abused terms.
Yes, yes. So we have, in release goal land, we have a way of saying, well, we would like to look at this in terms of the assumptions we're making. If we do the work we need to on the Epic end, on the Pirate Canvas end, then we know what assumptions we've got. Let's build a release before the MVP. We'll call it a RAT. And we're not making up words. You can go and Google riskiest assumption test. And it's a nice way to set stage a whole bunch of little releases leading up to an MVP, and each of those releases can have some actual business value in its own right. So this is where we get into something weird. The scenarios come before the stories. Well, we're talking BDD. BDD attaches scenarios to features. Features are the atoms of release planning. If we can work at that level for most of our analysis activities, most of our product squad work, and only worry about breaking a feature down into stories when we're about to go and deliver it. We can hand that off to a feature squad and say, okay, well, now you guys go and break this down into stories. We will get you represented regularly on our product squad. And we talked a little bit about how to go about that last week, so that you will understand these acceptance test scenarios, acceptance criteria in detail, and then you tell us when we're breaking assumptions. So that flow from scenarios to stories is normal for BDD, but for most of the Agile world, it seems weird. We're about to see something a little bit more weird. We have this, I think everybody's accepted the ideas of Kanban now. Even Scrum guys have courses on Kanban. Their Kanbans don't look very much like this. We have a canvas of some sort. The reason I'm talking about Pirate Canvas rather than the lean product management canvas stuff is we want stuff that tells us about the numbers, and the lean product management stuff, it doesn't give us a basis for prioritization and release planning. And Pirate Canvas does. That's why we like it. But we have to inform it. We have to do a bunch of data science on the products we have in the field, or if we don't have products in the field, then we have to do a bunch of data science on some source of scientific data, whether we're purchasing it or whether we're getting subject matter expertise in, or however we're getting it, to inform our canvas. And we'll have a very brief glimpse of a canvas, because we're trying to pack 2 days of XPM ideas into half an hour, so we can really only give a taster. We want to be able to break our epics, our epic landscape, for, well, basically each epic, we want to break it down into releasable features that will hit a particular release goal. You know, we don't want all the features in the world, the ones that we think we're going to need. And we have some specific practices for doing that. And they are informed as we go along by system integration testing for the features we currently have in the field. And as we deliver each of these features, we can get better definition on the features from the epics that we need to take out. We just looked at how our priorities might change because of market bottlenecks, but our release plans might change because of organizational bottlenecks, because of learnings. And so we want to take those learnings into account continuously. They don't do us any good if we learn something and we wait 3 months for some PI planning meeting before we get to take them into account. So we have a way of going about that in small teams, and that's where that product squad idea comes in. We have to be able to take these features and get estimates, not just of the budget required to deliver the feature, but of the business values of the features, so we can do an ROI prioritization. Now, a lot of people in the audience may be familiar with WSJF, cost of delay, prioritization, and so on, CD3. There are some problems with those. What we like is to start with an ROI-based prioritization and then discreetly bring in cost of delay issues, and we can talk about how we do that later on. And that's informed by feature integration testing, where we have production-like environments, and we are trying to understand, as we deliver each feature, what we can learn from it, what the way that its incidents and the inflections and analytics of delivering a feature, what that says to us about our estimates. So we have to learn continuously, and if we can't take those learnings in continuously, if we only get them later on, well, then we can't use them for prioritization, and we just saw what that means. So then we've got the usual inner loop of the stories per feature. If we can think of each row there as a feature delivery squad, if we were doing proper Agile. Does that make sense so far?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I want to whiz through this so we can get to the question bit. And so I'm only going to give some glimpses of what we do to be able to deliver on that how. The how here is how we expect the people involved in product management are going to behave. So we begin with a cross-reference of the pirate metrics with impact mapping, the why, who, how, what stuff, and eliminating, or not eliminating, identifying the assumptions that link them so we can have analytics for them. We have to be able to take each epic that we get that way, because the why, who, how, what, that's the normal form for an epic in XSCALE's breadth first product management. We have to be able to derive features, and we have to understand them breadth first. We can't spend huge amounts of time drilling into each feature, getting it all down to ticky-tacky acceptance criteria when we're not necessarily going to deliver that feature. We haven't done any release planning yet. So we want to be able to get this breadth first stuff to complete very rapidly. So we talk in terms of themes as categories of acceptance criteria, not the detailed stuff, just does this feature have any acceptance criteria in this category or not? We make a matrix of ticks. Where do we get the features from? We've got a number of ways of deriving features. There's a very neat way to get a backbone of features, and I learned from Al Gurner back when we worked together at UST Global, that there were two acronyms for patterns of features we often see. One for features in an experience-oriented epic, one for features in an ecosystem-oriented epic. In other words, one that's about experience and one that's about connecting the experience of multiple market segments. So that's where we can get features from. Or we could go back to the end of the 20th century, Ward Cunningham's CRC carding techniques. They work very, very well for eliciting features. So by combining those with this acceptance matrix of features and themes, we can then try and get closure of the conversation between the design, business, technical stakeholders about what features do we need for this release, for this epic, for this release. I should also say we have a way of getting them to see eye to eye. We call leadership as a service, but that's outside the scope of what we're doing today, I think. Okay, then once we've got these features, we have to get some numbers against them. We have to understand budgets per feature. Now, there's an enormous reaction against estimation in Agile. There's a thing called no estimates. And at a story level, this is very sensible. When it comes to making release plans, we often need to be able to give commitments about dates. Even if we don't have a hard date in mind, someone wants to know, okay, great, when do we need to get those people over there to get ready to bring something to market? There are lead times on design, there are lead times on marketing. There's a whole business cycle outside of delivery that needs dates. So we have to be able to give them. And often what you'll find is that we've got these Agile teams who have been nicely protected from having to estimate release plans as if it was something they couldn't do. And then you've got architects who'll go, oh, I'm a very smart architect. I will figure out the dates. And well, that's just nuts. We've got people who know more about the technical constraints at the coalface than those architects. And for that matter, we have people who know more about the design constraints and the business constraints. But once we get an architect, we say, you give us some high-level estimates, then we've got another scapegoat, just like the product owner is a scapegoat for our decisions about the design we didn't give to the actual stakeholders. So we don't want scapegoats. We want the architects to be present in this product squad as technical stakeholders. So we also need to get estimates around business value. We actually want to think about value and budget as two components for an ROI calculation. We have a non-linear ROI calculation because, well, for a start, it's very difficult to get business people to give you estimates in actual dollars. They don't want to be the person who said that this feature would be worth $5 million and it was only worth 50,000. But they're happy to tell you that this feature is less valuable than that one. And that's all we really need to be able to play this business bingo game. So it is intentionally evocative of planning poker, but here the numbers are multiples of a bucket of time or money. Usually they're multiples of FTE days or squad weeks, something like that. So this cube is a glass maze in Germany, 10 by 10 by 10. I am praying that there is a column of like a toilet block in the middle that's very easy to get to. I don't know. But anyway, that's often what you have when you're looking at a big mass of features that you've got from the kind of analysis we talked about so far. We don't understand the dependencies. We don't understand what has to come first. And that's where cost of delay comes in. But cost of delay decisions really have to be made discreetly. If we start with ROI calculation and then bring cost of delay, we have an orderly way of working it in, and statistically smear the components. We don't divide urgency by duration, which is just nuts. Instead we'll go, well, which parts of this big thing are urgent? And we can split it up using the acceptance criteria we talked about. So here we have a picture of some of the people who were involved in Kaching. I've vectorized it to protect their identity. So, well, maybe I've made a portrait of them. I might have just doodled it with pencil. Anyway, but this was the first time we played this game of release refactoring, because after we've done all of that numbers work, we have to understand which parts of which epics are going to have the most value for specific release goals. Which parts do we have to have for them? Which parts can float through to other release goals? And which parts maybe we don't care about them at the moment, but they're sort of, in Moscow terms, they'll come back in later on. We want to be able to re-enter this game whenever we learn something. So release refactoring is a game for both product squads and portfolio councils, because portfolio councils are kind of thinking about learning as a product to the organization, as a market. In terms of where this stuff lives, I'll rattle through this. We looked at this last week. DevOps is really our continuous delivery loop plus the basic retros and chapter meetings we need to keep many autonomous squads aligned to a 3D Kanban. What we're talking about today are another bunch of loops on top of this that are all around the stuff on the other side of that yellow curve we looked at before, and working in conjunction with people who are represented out of the feature delivery chapters in a thing we call a stream council. And then maybe next week we should do something from XBA, where we look at how, if we've got a whole bunch of self-managing value streams using these techniques, how do we plug them together to get a self-directing?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful to understand that this is actually not equaling anarchy or chaos, but you can put it in a different way. That would be helpful.
Okay.
Whoa.
Yeah. I'm out of gas.
Not bad. Barely 35 minutes. That was okay.
Okay. Good.
So,
questions?
Yes, please.
Lots of them, I expect. How many people do we have online? Oh, we've got a few questions.
Yeah.
You tell me, Stefan. Someone must have a question for us.
There's so many wasp stories popped into my mind when I was listening to what you were telling. So all the problematic issues that happened left and right of the path to glory, you know, so building features, no one understands why they are built except for the one person that is trying to improve his or her CV for the next career gig in a different organization. You know, salespeople desperately trying to squeeze some features out of you because the bonus is at risk.
Yeah. Well, that's where we get into XBA land, because we have to
Yeah.
change the way that reward structures work to be able to stop some of those games. We talked a little bit about that last week as well.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in questions to do with the way that we build products. That's what we're talking about
Yeah.
today.
And Gideon has
S-
one. Can you
oh, go
explain
ahead.
green and blue in the cycle? So he was referring to the last slide that you showed.
Oh, sorry. So what, ask me the question again. I didn't hear it.
Can you explain the green and the blue in the cycle context?
Oh, yes, I can. Okay. So the idea is we have three pattern languages. The reason we talk about pattern languages rather than frameworks is you only apply a practice pattern when you are experiencing the problem or the risk that it's supposed to solve. Otherwise, you are violating the fundamental agile principle of Yagni. You aren't going to need it. And also, for that matter, you'd be not working on the bottleneck constraint. So when we have these huge frameworks, whether it's Lean UX or Lean Kanban or SAFe or less, or for that matter, XSCALE itself taken as a framework, we're not being very sensible. We're not being consistent in the way we're applying Agile. So we have three pattern languages in XSCALE. One is all about DevOps, so the continuous delivery, continuous adaptation. This is sort of the Kim Phoenix project 3 ways view of DevOps. Throughput diagrams here we borrow from a combination of Gold-Rat and Lean cumulative flow diagrams. So they don't exist in either one, but that's okay. If you go and look at some of our video explainers, you'll see more about that. xscalealliance.org is where we collect that sort of stuff. So then the next pattern language, the one we're talking about today, product management, is really how do we feed that DevOps capability? In the 3 ways, we have a way that's all around exploratory work and making certain that we can investigate the solution space in parallel, initially in terms of solving incidents, but properly speaking, in terms of exploring that epic landscape breadth first, so that we can find Mount Everest of value and identify when it moves, because unfortunately, the world is a very dynamic place, and trying to get product market impact means we have to impact a moving target in the market. So these are all simple re-entrant numbers games. Now the stream council on the right, we talked about product squad before. The reason this says stream council rather than product squad is we want representatives of the feature squads and any shared systems squad that we need to coordinate them. We want representatives of their chapters to work on the product squad. And that gives us an ability to bring them in as the technical stakeholders I talked about before. So we have a pattern of chapters and councils we borrow from the Haudenosaunee, who most people know as the Iroquois Confederacy. It was an agile civilization in North America from the 13th to the 18th century. Actually, they're still there, but they're no longer a political power, which they were right up to the War of Independence. So there's a whole bunch of patterns trying to resolve. I'm never going to say the phrase whole bunch of anymore. I say it too much. There are many patterns that we borrow from the Haudenosaunee in terms of how we organize these representatives of chapters and the numbers that go with this descaling metrics that we might talk a little bit more about next time, I think. So then finally, we have a way of coordinating multiple value streams in a portfolio and motivating them to share information, in particular to accelerate the flow of learnings through the organization. So this is business agility. It's around how we react to the learnings we get from reflecting on our own behaviors and representing the changes in behavior of the market and the rest of the organization. So those 3 languages, the green is the stuff that is in focus for that language. The blue is still in context. We have to make certain we understand how these things connect up, or we can't really describe where the information comes from or goes to as we flow through the patterns. Does that make sense?
Gideon asks, why in context and in focus?
Well, when we're training and coaching people in these pattern languages, we have to give them a focus, but we want to make certain that we are taking a breadth-first approach to delivering their learning. And I should say, it's not even delivering their learning. Really what we want is to be servant leaders to a bunch of change participants when people are taking on learning as the product and the organization as the market. We want to get the most product market impact there as well. And to do that, we have to apply the pirate metrics to the flow of learnings through the organization. And all of that R stuff is actually directly relevant to prioritizing change programs as well as transformation programs. So with this in focus, in context stuff, it's because we have to put the specific practices into a principled context so that they will all glue together and people will have that breadth first view of the way the value stream and the portfolio as a whole works. Without that, we're teaching them things that will require them to delegate to other people. And we want them to be fully empowered to work with the other people to understand what they're doing. So that's why the in context part.
Okay, Megana asks, what type of maturity models exist for product management?
Oh, that's Stefan. I think that one might be one for you.
I'm not so sure I'm able to answer this at the moment. So we started working on our agility assessment framework, and it's quite a challenge to create a framework or a product with a bunch of people who do the same as we do for a living, coaching other people. You know, it's really tricky. So we continue working on that, and I think we will manage to ship something in, well, late summer probably. But at the moment, I'm not sure whether there are actually maturity models. It always depends on the context, because I mean, there's so many different types of organizations out there with different cultures, a different history. How was the culture perceived, right? Was it designed from the beginning?
Yeah.
Was it created organically over decades or over years? How is the culture changing? I mean, if you double the number of people working for an organization on an annually basis, rest assured your culture will change, because you won't be able to get so many people on board that share your cultural ideas to actually keep up this rate. So there are so many different aspects. It's really complex, and we haven't yet found a way to cut ourselves through this jungle of complexity.
Okay, well, I have an idea here. So we do have an ability to characterize business throughput. And you would expect that if we're doing a good job of product management, that we're going to accelerate business throughput. So there are a lot of complicating factors here, because we also have to look at the flow of learnings. If it turns out that, yeah, we're only getting good product management to happen in one part of the organization, we might not see any real impact on throughput diagrams. But if we were able to isolate a particular value stream or in a portfolio or a portfolio in an organization in terms of throughput over time, we could differentiate those curves and look at where product management has had an impact in terms of inflection points. Now, that's not the maturity assessment we'd like to have, because we'd like to have one that's about the practices. Are you doing this stuff properly or are you not? But it doesn't really matter if you're not doing it properly and you still have great market impact. And likewise, it doesn't matter if you have no market impact and you are doing someone's idea about doing it properly. So I think it has to be throughput based.
I totally agree with you. The trouble I always have with maturity models is that they have this kind of absolute approach to providing some kind of insight. You know, but what does maturity actually mean? I mean, what is it? What's the essence of it? And by the way, what happens if you are mature? What happens after that? You know, you stop developing, or it's never changing, or so it's. from my experience, it's very tricky. I believe there are so many different maturity models that you basically have a one-to-one relationship of maturity models to organizations. And
I
then
agree
the
with
whole
you.
idea of a maturity model becomes obsolete, at least from
Yeah.
my perspective.
Well, also, so that Kaching program I talked about, and I took credit for all this $9 billion of value in one sentence. Well, I didn't dream that up. Maybe the reason that we did well was because it was time. There was a huge opportunity, and whoever had the original idea was very astute. Maybe the fact that we executed on it was the least of it. I don't think so, because I was there and I saw a lot of the problems that we had to solve to fix it. So if there is such a thing as maturity in product management, it has to be a matter of reliable capability. The trouble is the experiments are too few and far between, and the numbers that we use to characterize those experiments are not agreed by everybody. So we can suggest a model and wind up in a place where we're measuring nonsense.
Yeah, but it feels good to measure nonsense because it actually provides some sort of feeling that we're doing it in a scientific way, which of course is rubbish.
The illusion of control.
Yeah,
Epicycles and phlogiston, they still exist, I
yeah,
tell you.
yeah. So maybe I'm a bit overly strict with the term and the thought model behind it, or the mental model, because I have a background in natural science, so I always come back to the experience I had with my professors when I tried to explain what I was measuring, and they said, "What nonsense, Wolpers! Come on, do this in a proper way, and don't bother me otherwise."
Yes.
Given by that standards, a lot of what currently is sold as a maturity model is pure snake oil, right?
Yeah.
So I mean,
So I think that's where what I'm really looking for in breadth first agile product management is these sorts of very simple practice patterns where we're dealing with concrete numbers and we can have many iterations of them as we go along. That gives us an ability to test them and to understand what's good and what's bad. So the patterns we're looking at here have been refined over the last 5 years since that Kaching program. In several places. I was hoping we would have Chris Young on the call today, but unfortunately he's got family obligations. Chris and I did some work in a different program in CBA, liquidity program early in the piece, and then he's gone on to apply this stuff at HSBC in Switzerland and in UK. And he's also president of Swiss Agile Association and XSCALE steward in Switzerland and so on. So the experience that we've had in doing this stuff, I think that's where the value is. When we build up maturity in skills that we've been able to prove actually have the effect that we are claiming, that we get predictability, we get impact, and we get learning flow. That's where we can talk about maturity. We have to have numbers attached to those. And I care much more about the metrics, how we measure, than a specific set of thresholds for if this number gets to this percentage, then we call you a number 3 rather than a number 4 in product CMMI. I think those threshold numbers are all nonsense. What we want to do is improve capability.
which, by the way, then opens a whole different Pandora's box, right? Then we actually move from data-driven project management decisions to the whole management structure and the leadership issue of the organization in question, right?
Yes, into business agility land. Exactly
Yes.
right.
So this is the interesting part. It's all interconnected. This is the fun part of it. So how do we get rid of the Jim Barkdales in the future? This if we have data, let's go with the data. If all we have is opinion, let's go with mine. Yeah.
Hippos are always right, I tells you.
Oh yeah, I like my hippos. You just
You have to. It's very important to like them. Okay. Any other questions at the moment?
just deactivated the microphone. Magana would be interested in learning more about the Kaching business case, I believe.
Oh, okay.
Some kind of
So
blog post available or something like that where she could.
I don't have one up yet, and that's mainly because I haven't gone around and got the permissions of the people whose testimonials I've gathered. We did a couple of internal case studies back when we were doing it, and it's a really interesting case study because not only did we wind up in a great place, but the journey that we took in getting there was very instructive. So the answer there is yes, we will have some up, and I have undertaken at the Business Agility YOW conference, as long as my paper is accepted, I've undertaken to speak on it publicly there. And I think 5 years later is enough time that the bank's shares aren't going to crash if I speak out of turn. So I guess the best answer is that's coming, but I'm happy to tell a little story now if you guys would like.
Go for it. Stories are great. And then we close at 10 or in 5 minutes.
That sounds good. Okay. So, all right. I was coaching Chris Young's liquidity program in Treasury and Risk. I had been doing for about 6 months. And I was strategist for the transformation program in the bank. So I was doing a lot of work with Kenny Joseph, Des Webster, Tim Whiteley's group, who really were the people who brought the bank over the line as far as agility was concerned. This was before any of the current ideas about Agile in that bank were even a gleam in someone's eye. At the end of 2013, I shared a stage with the Group CIO, Michael Hart, and he declared Agile is one of the 5 pillars of this bank's future, and then had me talk for 10 minutes. And that was a direct result of what we did on Kaching. Plus what Sarah Atkinson did in Wealth, what Dave Bales did when he picked up from me in Liquidity, and the other coaches who were involved. Now I've got to name everyone, damn it, it's like the Academy Awards. Dave Martin Drieslow, Leandro Pinto, Nico, you know who you are. Okay. If I name everyone in the bank, I'm going to get in trouble. If I don't name anyone in the bank, I'm going to get in trouble. I'm in trouble now. I shouldn't have said those names. Oh, well. Okay, so maybe we cut that part out when we do the recording. When I went in, I trained the delivery team, and they basically wanted to know XP, and that's what I taught them. A little bit of Kanban. We spent a couple of days on that, and I asked them if they needed any coaching. No, they didn't. Thank you very much. And off they went. And I had a call from the general manager there about 3 months later. And he said, well, to cut a long story short, I'm very, very unhappy. Why are you unhappy? I'm unhappy because, as far as I can tell from talking to the Scrum Masters, or whatever you call them, I'm unhappy because this Agile stuff's doing exactly what you said it would do. It's transparent. Everything's gone red. And I can't live like this. I don't have the apologetics that I need to be able to deal with these sorts of problems. Usually in a waterfall program, I know what to do. And I said, well, what do you need to be able to deal with these guys? He said, well, look, fundamentally, I don't need apologetics. I need predictability. And I said, well, that's not exactly what Agile's for. And he said, well, then I can't exactly do it anymore. And I said, well, can I have a weekend to think about it? He said, yes. I came in on the Monday morning with an idea, and it was the germ of this breadth first product management pattern language. And I did a lot of hand waving. And Rob is an ex-developer, very good systems head. And after I had run out of gas, he said, well, okay, that sounds plausible to me. I can imagine how that would work. Where else in the bank is it being done? And I said, nowhere, Rob. And he said, okay, well, where else in the world is it being done? Where are the case studies? Nowhere, Rob. I thought of this in the bath yesterday. And he said, let me get this straight. You're asking me to risk my career on an idea you had in the bath yesterday. I said, yes, Rob, I don't know any other way to solve it. He said, well, I won't do that. I said, then I can't solve your problem. And he said, well, actually you can. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I won't risk my career, but I'll risk yours. And I said, huh? And he said, I'll give you 3 months. You prove that this works. If it works, great, we'll keep doing it. If it doesn't, then we go back to waterfall. I don't want to go back to waterfall, he said, so that's why I'm giving you a shot. 3 months later, we were green across the board in the program services group in CBA, which That was the first time that it ever happened to any program in the bank. And we stayed green across the board for the next year. And you might go, wait a second, how did that come out of product management? Well, because when we do this breadth first stuff, it gives us an ability to continuously adjust expectations and to maintain predictability in terms of the funding of the program, so that we can make intelligent choices about where we may want to grow budgets, or where we may want to modify various kinds of design or business expectations. So, so that continuous flow of learning between those three stakeholder groups, technical, design, and business, that's what let us keep it on the rails. And it was good for everybody, of course, but the real beauty of it was that when we moved on from that program into other parts of the bank, what we had done had given an example of what Agile could be. Unfortunately, the way that banks work often doesn't retain the learning. And I am not saying that CBA now uses the XPM pattern language. As far as I know, it doesn't. So the culture still is very wedded to Agile delivery. That was retained. That's great. But anywhere we go, when we advance the state of the art of it, we have to figure out, how do we communicate it? How do we keep communicating it? And that's kind of why we had to wrap it up and call it XSCALE. End of story.
Perfect. Pete, thanks a lot for the insights, and we will be back next week, right?
We sure will. I think next week, let's do chapters and councils and leadership as a service.
Awesome. You will send me a catchy line?
I shall send you some promo stuff.
Awesome.
Thank you, everybody who was on the call. And we'll wrap this up, and we'll put a recording somewhere and we'll announce it.
Thanks, everyone. Bye. Talk to you next week.
Bye.